Give me the state of the state, please, legally, for Donald Trump, who seemed to kind of melt down as revelations about his net worth and about the value of the properties was revealed. He left that case as it continued in the courtroom. Give me the state of the state on him and many of his cronies who are also moving parts on this legal chessboard.
Well, we had this case in New York. The case in New York is very significant because it involves his empire. And David K. Johnston wrote colorfully that it was the corporate death penalty for Trump. And it's certainly not good news. Now, if he manages to win on appeal later on, it may not be such a death penalty. He may get relief. But for right now, you have to deal with what the trial court does. And what the trial court did was to grant a summary judgment. Now, nobody asked for a jury trial in this case. If they had, they might have gotten one, not clear under New York law, but no one asked for a jury trial. So when Trump throws his hands up in the air and says, "Where's the jury? Why don't we have a jury?" Well, one reason, because your lawyers didn't ask for it. And number two, it might not have been granted, but you would have lost nothing if you really wanted it to at least ask for it. Had he had a jury trial, it would have been 6 members and it would have been 5 out of 6. So a 5-1 vote against him would not be a hung jury. It would be a verdict in the civil case against him. Anyway, he didn't have that. So it was a judge trial. The judge looked at all the papers that were filed before the trial and he said, "There's nothing to try here. I'm only looking for 2 elements. One is, did you make a lot of false statements, which he and his sons, the judge found, had done for years? And did you disseminate them? Did you send them out to people like lenders and insurance companies?" Well, he did that too. So there was nothing to try. Now, Trump keeps saying, well, nobody relied on it. Again, we used this last week. If you and I get together and you say your studio is worth 50 million and I say my law office is worth 50 million and we persuade some bank to lend us $100 million against that and we build a building and the building goes to $110 million, the banks haven't lost any money. Did what you and I do was kosher? No, it was not kosher. And if there wasn't a loss in that sense, it's still okay. So that's one of the non-issues in the case. And the lawyers keep bringing it up and bringing it up. And the judge says, go present that to the Court of Appeals, but stop wasting my time with it. He eventually fined them, sanctioned them $7,500 each, all of the lawyers. So when Trump saw how bad it was going and that all that was going to be left in the trial court was a trial starting Monday on how much he should pay, whether $250 million or even more, because he'd been found liable for this fraud, for this violation of the New York statutes, which, by the way, they canceled his New York certificate to do business. He didn't need to be a New York company, but he was. So that's a remedy. If you're a New York company and you commit fraud, you commit those 2 elements, then they can cancel your business license. So he showed up basically to counter-program the trial, to go out at every single chance that he had and to scream Mark and say it was so unfair and to say a bunch of stuff that really was not germane to the case. What else is new? And one of the interesting things, if you want to get into it, was he brought the judge's law clerk into it.
Yeah, well, that's very much relevant because it speaks to the gag order, and that is so much a part of the Trump we know. He's a smack talker, and his followers do more than talk. They actually launch threats and are capable of violence. And so, yeah, please speak to that.
Well, he is a smack talker. Let me just say in general about these gag orders and the smack talking. Trump does not control anymore the FBI, the Marshal Service. He doesn't control the Department of Justice. He doesn't control the police or the apparatus in any of those courts or in any of those states. So to some extent, I do see it from Trump's point of view. He's very, very unhappy with what's happening. This is a free country. If you want to be foolhardy enough to say bad things about all these people, I do think that if the case goes to the appellate courts, especially if it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court with 3 members picked by him, I think that they may say that this is within his, just what I just said. It may be very foolish. Why would anybody talk smack about the judge and the system that controls your fate? But at the same time, if you want to do that, you probably can do that. And as to the threats of violence, right, they would say, well, they can monitor all of the threats of violence. Let me just say one thing. It may be very controversial. I don't want your mail to blow up, okay? But this law clerk for the judge, I was a law clerk to a judge. My name was never mentioned in court. A federal judge never says, what a great argument. Let me see what Mr. David Katz, my law clerk, thinks about that. Would you hold on a minute? The judge might go, take a recess and might talk to the clerk. But apparently their style in that state court in New York is they do kind of bandy it about, and they talk about it right in front of the litigants, right in front of the lawyers. Miss Greenfield, what do you think? I need to confer with my law clerk, Allison Greenfield. And that was reported in the New York Times. So I think that the way that Trump and his gang got the name of this Allison Greenfield to run her Instagram was from it being mentioned in court and from her having her name mentioned in the New York Times, which for some people think is great fame. He tried to take it into infamy. That's what he always does. If you want to play on the Trump track and you think all you're going to get is acclaim, you better pay a little closer attention. So I do have one question about it, and I don't mean to be such a contrarian all the time. But the judge, knowing that that was going to happen, knowing that she had an Instagram photo of her smiling, standing next to Democratic Majority Leader of the Senate, Schumer, smiling, mightn't he have said to her before the trial got rolling, why don't you take that down? Why don't I maybe have a different law clerk assigned for this case who doesn't have anything like that on the Instagram? Because you know, if it were Biden being charged in Idaho or Texas in front of a state judge there, and the Democrats found out that the law clerk who was deeply involved in the proceedings had a smiling picture of her and Abbott, her and DeSantis, you know that it would be played up. Maybe not the coarse, crass way, but you know it would be disseminated. It would be sent out there, and the argument would be, hey, how come Biden doesn't have a fair judge? How come he has a state judge in Texas with a law clerk who's a huge fan of Abbott or DeSantis?
Such a great argument that you've made. I can see why you're a good defense lawyer and a good prosecutor back in your old days as a prosecutor. But I will say this, David, they, just to be fair to the argument, but I think you've made a compelling argument, as I just said, but they perverted this already potentially damning, I mean, put aside how actually damning it is. They perverted the actual fact. They took that picture of Chuck Schumer and the law clerk, and they presented it as his girlfriend. Now, again, maybe they were just using it in the vernacular of, the girlfriend. It was like a slang kind of thing, his girlfriend, like, his homegirl, whatever but in Trump world, they play it for real, like that's really his girlfriend type thing, when in truth it's just a politician who takes a picture who he's not even going to remember it 4 seconds later, right?
Palling around. But again, if you want to try to figure out what Trump is going to use against you, think a little out of the box, think a little, put yourself in his shoes, that he would use the expression girlfriend when there's a picture of her standing next to Schumer and they're both smiling. Schumer may have chosen to take a picture with anybody who wanted a selfie, but guess what? She wanted to take a picture with a big Democratic politician. From their point of view, she's from New York City. She went to NYU. You know exactly how they're going to depict it. So I'm just saying, if I were the judge, and there's a lot of really smart law clerks, maybe for this case, right? At the very least, she deletes the social media post. I know they're going to go back and find it anyway. Maybe it's really better in a case like this. Be Caesar's wife if you're the judge. There's really smart law clerks, okay? Take a different law clerk from that case and ask them first, what's on your social media? Because is it predictable that Trump would do exactly what he did, that he would use that expression, girlfriend, palling around? And yes, his fans might take it one way, but is it actionable to call somebody's girlfriend? I mean, there's other words you could have used that would really get you in trouble. And that was one that, again, Trump went close to the line and he figured that's an expression. Now, I think what happened is the judge went back and said, if you make any more comments about any member of my staff, I'm going to lock you up. And he didn't want to get locked up. But he may go to the higher court, Mark, and appeal this or say he is being gagged. See another example how the judge is so unfair. He threatened to lock him up. Now he has to walk on pins and needles because he's so worried he's going to get locked up for exercising his First Amendment rights. Some higher court needs to intervene, the First Amendment. Try to eliminate those problems. This is always my advice to Fani Willis down there in Georgia. Think it through. Think what he's going to do when you drag him over to that horrible penitentiary, that horrible prison near Atlanta, Georgia. Think about the fact that he's going to play up the fact that it's a hellhole that's never been taken care of by the Democrats, and they're threatening them with this torture of being in this place, and that he's going to arrive with his caravan and his huge Trump plane and say, you know what, maybe I should let him appear just by telephone for the hearing. Maybe this isn't really working out my way to drag the former president. Her fans love it, and his fans hate it. Just figure it out. Just figure out not just the law, but figure out the optics of it. That's all I'm saying.
Just to follow up on that, David, is it reasonably something that could be done? The judge would, I always imagine this blizzard of stuff that a judge has to do before the case proceeds. You're saying you would add to that blizzard figuring out who's got an Instagram feed that could be damning?
Why not? Wouldn't you do that if you were trying this is the biggest case in state court, but in the history of the United States, biggest civil case, maybe the criminal case against Aaron Burr in New York was bigger, but I think those are the only two competing in U.S. history for the biggest biggest case in the history of the state courts of New York. So yeah, so maybe think it through that they're going to get all the social media on your law clerk, especially if she's appeared in the New York Times under her own name. I mean, when I was a clerk to a federal judge, if someone would have asked my name from the media, I mean, I guess they could have looked it up. But, you know, if you say, I'm David Katz and I went to NYU Law School, I went to Berkeley's Law School and this and that, it's so nice to meet a reporter for the New York Times and my name gets in the paper. I mean, you know, you're almost a public figure at that point once you go over, right, in a case like that. And so, you know, should she get dragged through it? You know, maybe not. Will they get dragged through it in Atlanta, Georgia, if they don't look out for the optics? I just think that they will. Let me make one comment about the person who flipped down there in Georgia and apparently has some very damning testimony against Sidney Powell. Okay. Now, you hear, I know I always sound like a contrarian. Someone said, why does David Katz always stand up for the defense? Well, one thing, I'm a federal criminal defense attorney, but I also get it. I really do get it. It's important that everybody's rights are respected. No one's above the law, but no one's beneath the law, right? That's the principle that made our country great. So this person is involved in this terrible thing. They went into this rural county in Georgia and they did dastardly things. And this man ought to be in that horrible hellhole of a prison in Georgia for 5 years. She says at the press conference, a mandatory minimum of 5 years. Then there's a debate about it. Now he wants to cooperate. He wants to help the prosecution. Guess what? Now it's not a felony at all. Now it's a misdemeanor. And now he doesn't need to serve even 1 day anywhere near jail. So when you have a witness like that, when that person testifies against Sidney Powell, that's why we say there has to be corroboration, because there's great concern that to not go to that horrible prison in Georgia for even a day and not for 5 years, that he would tell just about anything that the prosecution wants to hear. And that's why it's so important to corroborate people like that. And Mark, that's easier today because you have emails, you have all these text messages that are sent, you have surveillance cameras that are sitting around everywhere. So he probably can be corroborated. I'm just saying people really ought to be wary. You know, people say, why are so many people in prison? Why are so many minority people in prison? Well, a lot of times because somebody ratted them out because they were so scared of jail themselves and they embellished. Look out for that.
I guess deals are made all the time, though, aren't they, David Katz? I mean, you know, that kind of deal that you just described is pretty, you know, sort of a de rigueur. It's kind of just what's done.
That's exactly how the system works. The system would come to, you know, and the prosecutor argues back, look, if you want to find people who are involved in this crime that I'm prosecuting, you don't go to the College of Bishops. You don't find, right? You don't find priests as your witnesses. You find the fellow gangbangers. You find the guy who went down to that rural county in Georgia with her, the bail bondsman, and committed crimes with Sidney Powell. By the way, if I'm giving predictions, that's a very interesting case, Mark, because it's starting jury selection in about 2 weeks for the people who are entitled to a speedy trial and who asked for them. So that's Sidney Powell, who I think is in big trouble, not just because of that fellow rolling over on her, but I think because of a lot of things. But I think that what I've heard of this Chesebro or Chesbro, the lawyer, the Harvard Law School educated lawyer who worked on the Gore-Bush campaign, boy, I don't know. I think what they're going to end up saying against him is that you said that those electors were qualified, and they weren't qualified by anything but the Republican campaign. They weren't qualified by anything but Trump's campaign. And when you said that they were duly qualified, that meant that they had picked by law, that the legislature had picked them, that some official, neutral official in government had picked them, and therefore they were qualified. And all that qualified meant was qualified by the Republicans. And if that's the best piece of evidence that they have, I mean, is the jury going to convict beyond a reasonable doubt an attorney for giving that advice? Because by saying, use the word qualified, he knew how deceptive that was when they were only qualified by the Republican campaign. I guess we're going to find that out. But that is, if you're looking for a case that might end in an acquittal, That's the one. I don't think it's Sidney Powell's. I think it's that Harvard Law educated Kenneth Chesebro.
Wow. Yeah. And he is another one who wanted that fast trial. So things are kind of being fast tracked. This is a question that came in. Let me just try to. Kim, can you read it, please? Because I can't quite make it out.
Sure. Yeah, it says, easy one for Mr. Katz today. How far will Trump have to go to face tangible consequences for trash talk about anyone not on his defense team? And then facetiously, Scott Rittenberg asks, will he go after the janitors for not dusting off his seat? That one's optional.
So the tangible consequences, I think he means jail. Will he be remanded to custody and locked up? That's something I think Trump is very, very scared of. You know, they might take whatever that thing is on his head. They might take that off, and the whole world could see what's really on his head, because they do that in jails. They and it is Secret Service being in there. Despite that, it's a very scary place, and we think that they'll never have him really have a threatening moment with any other prisoner, or with the terrible conditions in a lot of our jails and prisons. And these are the holding cells, you know, where just a lot of unpredictable things can suddenly happen. With the Secret Service, they probably won't. Is Trump scared of that? Yeah, he is. That's why he didn't push it after he got admonished by that state judge, Engoron, in New York City just a couple of days ago. He didn't push it with the judge. And he's going to try very hard not to push it. By showing up in court, he takes the chance that the judge tells him, do this, do that, and he has a tantrum and he gets held in criminal contempt just like that. And the judge said, you just violated my order. That's, 2 days in jail. Bring your toothbrush. So he's very, very worried about that. I think that's one reason why he's not going to show up in either one of those federal courts unless he has to, because those so I think he's going to try very hard to avoid it. But the trash talk in terms of consequences, a judge might fine him, and he might like as someone said, when he showed up in that court in New York City, right, he got more publicity than he would at any rally in Nashua, New Hampshire. Yeah. He took all the oxygen out of the room again, right? And they didn't. Why does he have a right to have a press conference right outside the courtroom in a government building? You don't have a right to do that in federal court. In federal courthouse, right or wrong, they say no cameras allowed. And that's why we always see people outside of the federal courthouse, right? On the courthouse steps. They're not allowed to do that. Did anyone think that through? I don't know. Maybe they think that they're really vindicating his First Amendment rights to let him blast away at the judge at every break, but they allow him to do that in New York. Again, not thinking through the optics that this is not a normal trial. And within validating his due process rights, they ought to think through the optics of this situation. And so, no, I think that he can trash talk quite a bit. And I think what he's ultimately going to do with these gag orders is take them up to the higher court. He wants to set it up right. So a lot of it is baiting these judges. A lot of it is to get the judge to say something that'll sound really good in a brief to conservative appellate judges, maybe all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court and the 3 that he nominated.
That's fascinating. That really is. I just want to follow up on that for a second. David, would it have been possible for the judge in the New York case, in this fraud trial, to, as you say, think it through and say there will be essentially issue an edict from the bench that there will be no press conferences or other remarks made publicly outside of my courtroom on the grounds of this New York courthouse? Could he have done that?
He probably would have had the chief judge have to do that. And the chief judge might have thought, this makes it look like, do I have it in for him? How is this? Maybe he did think through the optics and he figured, You know what? Better to have him go vent out in front of the courthouse somewhere where it was safe and where he could be protected. If he had to go out to the street, someone throws an egg at him, something really weird happens because where he's going to be each break. He's going to come out in a more public area right in front of the courthouse on the courthouse steps. So maybe somebody did think that through.
Also, I would just ask, because I'm seeing it in the comments, what does Trump need to say that becomes actionable when it comes to the judge? Let's leave the clerk out now. Let's just talk about because the judge is a Marxist, Democrat, whatever he says, he's had it in for me since the beginning, et cetera. At what point is there a threshold? What roughly could that threshold be?
Well, I think that he can basically say that. Again, I don't agree with him. I don't think it's wise.
But your view is he can say whatever he wants about the judge, is kind of what you were saying.
I think about the judge, he can say I think if he makes a specific factual allegation, that judge took a bribe a year ago from Mr. Smith, okay, that might get to the point where it's so far not an opinion, it's so a false assertion of fact, that I think, just like you can't say that about just about anybody. But all of the adjectives, which is what he loves to throw around, they're all opinions. Now, in terms of tainting the jury pool, I've heard that argument over and over again. And Kim and I actually talked about this. How can you really taint a jury pool? Doesn't everyone have an opinion about this case? And what I said then, and I still believe, there are some people who don't watch the news. They're worried about their kids. They're worried about some other issue. They just don't like politics. But they vote, and they sign up for, or some of them don't even vote. But anyway, they get called for jury duty, don't they? So you are hoping to have people like that, and you think, well, maybe those people can be tainted. But I think as a rationale that by him making a comment, you're tainting the jury pool. There is such saturation coverage that to me, it ends up looking selective. It looks like saying, I didn't like that one remark. That one tainted the jury pool, not realizing it really is kind of a drop in the ocean by now. I mean, sure. It's nonstop, right, all day long. And you can certainly say things. Again, I don't think it's wise, but you can say that your judge is part of the deep state. You can say that your judge is deranged. As I say, nobody does that except Trump. Senator Menendez will never, ever do that about any of the people in his case. But Trump wants to try the case in the court of public opinion. And I think that he knows deep in his heart and his head, that the evidence is so overwhelming in all of these cases, except the New York criminal case, the hush money to the porn star. All the other three cases have just overwhelming evidence against him.
I don't think you don't need to go deep into his heart to find the realization.
Don't talk to me that way.
All right. So
this one in New York is deep in his pocket. I don't think he thought through what losing his business certificate would mean and having to go to a receiver before he takes a dime. He can't loot these companies. He can't make a sweetheart deal and sell them to Ivanka or to a friend. He can't sell them to a Russian who suddenly wants to pay a high price for them. He sold a property down in Florida for some ridiculous inflated price to some Russian. And there's credible evidence that it was money laundering. But I guess
same thing happened in New York at his properties in New York. Exactly the same thing.
So I know.
I think that I saw David Johnston's show that you did. It was wonderful, from Brussels.
Yeah.
And he said, he figured out the guy shows up with a bag of money. It's like, well, I'm not going to ask any questions to bag of money, but guess what? You're going to pay 10% more for the property. And he said there's really evidence. There's really evidence of that happening over the years with Trump.
Yeah. So, Kim, go ahead. Sorry. Do you have something, Kim? No?
Kim? Now you call on me. Yes.
Well, I mean, I can't. The man's making a comment. I can't stop him in the middle.
It's all true. So, and I don't even know how important this is, honestly, but it is breaking news today, and it's pertinent to having David Katz on with us today. Trump's attorneys, and of course they're going to try to throw everything that sticks to get these charges against him dismissed. But today they asked the federal judge in Washington, D.C. to dismiss his election interference indictment, claiming he is protected from prosecution in that particular case by presidential immunity. So since they made the claim today, I wonder if there's any there. Is that a real argument they can make, and does it have any merit?
Well, there are different conspiracies in the D.C. case. One is a conspiracy to have these false slates. That's what this Cheeseboro down in Atlanta state court is charged with. But that's one of the overall conspiracies that, remember, only Trump is charged. Some people are charged as unindicted co-conspirators there, but the only one charged is Trump. So whether Trump can have slates certified in these various states, it seems to me very far-fetched. I don't see what the presidential privilege is going to be. There may be some other things that they claim are covered by this presidential privilege. What people have talked about is executive privilege. Executive privilege is usually in foreign affairs. That's kind of gotten lost in all of this. But when the president says, we really need to back up Ukraine with these weapons and do this and do that, and I'm acting as the executive, and you want now my aide that I talked to about that to go testify in Congress or in court, that was the classic executive privilege. Anything that looks sort of political and corrupt like this wasn't even covered by the executive privilege. So this presidential privilege thing, I think this one is going nowhere. They say, the Department of Justice and Jack Smith, that a lot of these requests are just to delay. Give the court something to do, delay, no matter how fast the court acts on them. They'll say, we didn't have time. We were following motion X, Y, and Z. We didn't have time to prepare for the trial in March. And they've said that this is really a gimmick. The Department of Justice said this is a gimmick by Trump and his lawyers. They should all be shot down. They should be summarily denied because otherwise we won't keep the March date. And this is the only case that I think can go to trial before the election. I think it's the only case that maybe will change voters' minds so that they'll say, you know what, wait a second. Maybe we should go with DeSantis or somebody else because this guy, he's got legal problems all day long. And now on top of it, a jury, 12 people just came in and 3 of them were not the Washington, D.C. stereotype that we have. You look at the jurors, you look at, they were really a diverse group of people. There are probably going to be Republicans on there. There'll be white people on there. And all 12 of them convicting Trump. I think that's one. And so the system really wants the trial to go by then. And I think that the judge there says it's in the public interest that we know guilty or not guilty from a jury by March. There may be other public interests in you or I having delays in our trial because we need more time. We have really legitimate reasons. But here, when you look at the public interest in people knowing this trial has to go by March. That's what I think they're going to ultimately take up to the U.S. Supreme Court and say, no, the public interest is only a personal interest. And if you need more time to get ready, and that's why I think the lawyers are going to try to do everything and the government's going to keep saying no, that what they were doing was all surplusage. It was all besides the point. It was also they could say, we filed 10 motions. That's what we were doing. And the judge is going to say, you can file 100 motions, but March is when the trial starts. You better be ready. And I think they're going to run up to the appellate courts in about January and say, we did everything that we could. We couldn't get ready. This is a rush to judgment. It's only because he's a Republican president, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's the hill that they're going to fight on. The hill they're going to fight on is to move that March trial to a date just before or just after the election so that it doesn't impact the voters and that Trump wins.
Wow. Wow. That's terrific. I love it. David, we're out of time. You mentioned the Supreme Court. I'd love to next week maybe address a couple of the other things that don't relate to Trump.
Can I mention one real quick? Because we talked about this, the Consumer Protection Agency. A lot of people thought that the U.S. Supreme Court was going to say, because they're so anti-regulation, this Consumer Protection Agency is the one that Senator Warren fought for. It was stopped by the Republicans forever. It goes after things like payday lenders that charge like 100% interest. It goes after pretty raw fraud. It's a government agency that absolutely should exist and be funded. The Republican interest groups, the Chamber of Commerce types, I don't know why they fight for these scammers. I think they ought to say, we don't want to help the scammers, give twice as much to this agency. But that has not been the business establishment. They have fought this court, they fought this agency over and over again. Their latest argument is that it's funded by the Federal Reserve, Mark. It's not funded by a normal appropriations bill.
That's how they're trying to bring this case, right? They're trying to
argue that under the Constitution, everything has to be funded by an appropriations bill. As Justice Kagan just said, that's interesting because for 250 years, we funded things by other than appropriations bills. And even the conservatives, if you want to call Kavanaugh and Roberts conservatives, seemed very unfriendly to the argument. It looks like the consumer agency will survive, that its funding will be permitted. And that's some good news from this Supreme Court. That's some good news that the argument went so well for consumers.
Good news and surprising news for all the reasons that you just mentioned. Yeah, didn't expect it, really didn't. And I thought that it would be used, maybe not as a template, but it would be one more brick in the wall that they are building against regulation. So I see the EPA sort of falling into the same category when it comes to regulation and trying to get around it one way or the other. And as you say, this is a surprise. I'm so glad that we spent a second on it. Thank you, David. David, so grateful for your contributions, and we'll talk next Thursday. Great.
Wonderful to be with you. Hi, Kim.
Kim. Hi, bye, Kim. David Katz, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.